Hi, everyone. Freddie Kiger. Welcome back for part 2 of the Moravians of North Carolina. And we're glad that you are with us. Thank you, Douglas and Dave, for your part in helping to present this. And where we left off in part 1 was the felling of the first tree in what would be Old Salem, or Salem at the time, and the future Winston-Salem. That took place on January the 6th, 1766, some 10 years before the Declaration of Independence. Receipt of letters from Herrnhut, which brought the name Salem and authorized the beginning for building January 30th of 1766. All that taking place. The moving of the Brethren February 19th, and on April the 12th, the siting of the first square, graveyard, and first home. Salem was well on its way. Those industrious Moravians created other settlements in the Wachovia tract as well. Friedberg in 1773, Hope in 1776, and Friedland in 1780. While those new settlements sprang to life, there was no question that Salem soon became the focal point of Wachovia trade and religious life. The town was truly established by 1771, so much so that the Wachovia administration moved there from Bethabara in 1772. Now, back in Bethabara, although a new Gemeinhaus, or congregational church, was built in 1788, and as we've mentioned, is still standing today, Bethabara as a town ceased to grow. Although there was a tavern, church, and home to a few tradesmen, it became essentially one of several agricultural villages in Wachovia. Truthfully, Bethabara became less of a town and more of a farm, its purpose to provide food for the residents of Salem. A black slave, Johann Samuel, was named farm superintendent in 1788. 13 years later, he was granted his freedom and allowed to rent land from the church. And so, throughout the 1800s, Bethabara continued to yield its influence to Salem. For the first Moravian settlement by the early 20th century, most of its structures had fallen into ruin. The foundations filled in to expand farmland. The great mill, after 100 years of use, abandoned. Its original timbers used to build a lumber company in the nearby bustling industrial town of Winston, just north of Salem. By the mid-1900s, Bethabara's frontier settlement was buried beneath cornfield. The potters and brewers' houses were private residences, and the 1788 church abandoned. Yet, with a great deal of community support and generosity, the city of Winston-Salem and the county of Forsyth stepped in and brought the first Moravian settlement in North Carolina back to life. Today, it's a living time capsule. Many structural foundations have been excavated. 2 historic buildings, the 1788 Gemeinhaus, has been restored. The other now serves as a craft shop. Palisade Fort has been recreated. The garden, laid out in 1759, has been reconstructed and is the only documented colonial community garden in the United States. This tract between the mill site and the town is being reclaimed. Even traces of the Great Wagon Road, the path through the wilderness the Moravians trekked to occupy Wachovia, has been preserved. Back in Salem, which of course traced its beginnings to Bethabara. By 1783, Salem was thriving. Evidence of that on a Thursday, July 4th, in the same year that the Treaty of Paris officially ended the War for Independence, pacifist-oriented Moravians celebrated the nation's newfound freedom with what is recognized as the country's first official Independence Day celebration. It's quite different from what we are accustomed. There were no fireworks, no sparklers, no rowdy parties. There was a parade, but it was a solemn one. There was reverent music and call and response singing in German by two choirs. Few citizens had actually participated in the conflict, but they celebrated that day, not so much for American victory over British oppressors, but far more so thanking God for the restoration of what the Salem's name meant: peace. Ecstatic over both victory and peace, North Carolina Governor Alexander Martin proclaimed July 4th a day of public thanksgiving. Though he did so, the governor's order was not widely heeded. Some of the more backwards area of the state didn't even hear about it until the designated date had passed. But Martin, on his way to somewhere else, stopped in the thriving settlement of Salem on June the 30th and mentioned the proclamation. Well, despite the short notice, Salem and other Moravian villages that made up the Wachovia settlement, well, they scrambled to put together something suitable. All the villages celebrated at least a little by ringing bells or attending church, but the grandest, most expensive celebration was, as you might imagine, at Salem. The Salem Diary for July the 4th, 1783, detailed the day's events. And since no one else had produced similar proof, it's pretty safe to say the first celebration was in North Carolina's Moravian, if you will, capital. Though independence came by way of military success, it is interesting to note again that Moravians' strong pacifist tradition, a belief that dated back to their founding amid religious struggles of the 15th century, known as a peace church. Members were forbidden to serve in the military. Their official diaries said of the recent war, and I'm quoting from that, "It does not accord with our character as brethren to mix in such political affairs. We are children of peace." So, no surprise that Salem's Moravians were thrilled that the fighting was over, for during it, both British and American patriots harassed them, collected fines, and even attacked them physically. Some young men actually hid in the forest to escape being pressed into service. And yes, a few, despite their religious background, joined in. The church later forgave them. The 1783 Independence Day celebration, as documented in the Salem Diary, started with trombone music, something the Moravians were quite fond of. And at 2 p.m., there was a love feast. 8 years later, in 1791, another red letter day for Salem, as the town welcomed President George Washington for a visit and tour of the settlement. We know much of the visit thanks to Washington's own diary and the official diary kept by the Moravian community. At the end of his southern tour, and probably exhausted, his first impression of Salem materialized as he approached. He thought how pleasantly it was placed on rising ground, surrounded by beautiful meadows, well-cultivated fields, and shady woods. He noted the houses were built in a German style, with trees surrounding them, forming a pastoral scene. Throughout his national tour, to avoid giving out or owing political favors, the president usually declined private offers of food and lodging. Rather, he sought public accommodations whenever possible. That said, he was impressed by the neatness of the Salem Tavern, and as he approached, he was greeted by music from the tavern's steps. With him was his private secretary, South Carolina's Major William Jackson, his pet greyhound named Cornwallis, and his white parade horse, Prescott. Though he was president, Salem's Moravians made a practice of not calling attention to or exalting individuals. Therefore, there were no festive decorations, and Washington understood that. Into every other southern town, he rode Prescott and was more often than not dressed in his continental uniform. But in Salem and nowhere else, respecting the Moravians' deep religious convictions, he entered town by coach, dressed in civilian clothes, and had Prescott led by a groomsman. On the arrival of his coach, great crowds gathered and followed to see the legendary commander. Washington noted that the Moravian ladies stood out of the crowds by their unique dress. Work dresses were solid blue or brown, and a cap that covered all signs of hair was worn indoors and out. Their caps and better dresses were always white. The ribbons that tied the cap and laced the jacket of the dress were colored according to the status of the woman. Little girls wore bright red. Single women wore pink. Married women, blue. And widows wore white. Washington was impressed with Salem's neat, orderly appearance and with the demeanor of its citizens. He considered it a well-governed, hard-working community. In turn, people of Salem were impressed with Washington's simple, friendly manner, particularly with children. The Moravians loved music, and Washington was so pleased with the band which played for him on his arrival that he asked if he could have their music to accompany his dinner. The next day, June the 1st, the president toured Salem, visiting its workshops and choir houses. He was particularly taken with the waterworks. In the afternoon, the leaders of the community made a formal address to the president, to which he responded. Governor Martin arrived late in the afternoon, and he and the president were, if you will, serenaded with song and instrumental music. At 4 o'clock on the morning of June the 2nd, the presidential party left Salem, and on June the 9th, crossed back into Virginia. Many places claim that George Washington slept there, but few have documentation to support such a visit. No surprise, Salem not only has documentation, but Washington helps in providing it. Beginning on the last day of May, he wrote, "Salem is a small but neat village, and like all the rest of the Moravian settlements, it is governed by an excellent police, having within itself all kinds of artisans. The number of souls does not exceed 200. Wednesday, June 1st, having received information that Governor Martin was on his way to meet me and would be at Salem this evening, I resolved to await his arrival at this place instead of halting a day at Guilford, as I had intended. Spent the afternoon in visiting the shops of the different tradesmen, the houses of accommodation for the single men and sisters of the fraternity, and their place of worship. Invited 6 of their principal men to dine with me, and in the evening went to hear them sing and perform on a variety of instruments, church music. I might add, conversation amongst the party was carried on in French. Well, the next day, June the 2nd, in company with Governor Martin, Washington went to the governor's home in Rockingham County, a few miles above Leakesville, which is today Eden. As the Moravians pushed their way into the 19th century, its themes, despite its dogmatic roots, seem to have been consolidation and adaptation. And the latter theme, that seemed generally positive for white males. For African Americans and women, it was not. For the first 3 decades, Moravians lived in North Carolina. Ordained deaconesses served in the church. 10 women that had been ordained elsewhere later served in Wachovia. 10 others were ordained there. Of 6 congregations founded in North Carolina, 5 were served by at least 2 deaconesses during the early years. However, after 1786, the Moravians of North Carolina ordained no more women for nearly 2 centuries, not until 1978. Likewise, African Americans who had once been welcomed into the Salem congregation were moved to the back of worship spaces. And in 1822, a separate church was created for Black Moravians living in Salem, and that was St. Philip's Moravian Church. Today, St. Philip's is the oldest continuously operating Black church in North Carolina. St. Philip's is also the only historically Black Moravian church in the United States. Returning to the 19th century, some Moravians actually began to purchase slaves, who at first, remember, worshiped alongside them. 2 years before the founding of St. Philip's, white Moravians stopped welcoming Blacks to their services and encouraged them to establish their own congregation, which of course they did. Despite this image, their first place of worship was a long log church, which they erected near an African-American cemetery. The congregation was composed mostly of slaves. Despite this, there indeed were some white Moravians who continued to work with the Black congregation. For example, over the next 9 years, white sisters conducted Sunday school classes at the Black church until an 1831 North Carolina law banned the teaching of slaves to read. That law in response to the Nat Turner insurrection up in southeastern Virginia. With the passage of that North Carolina measure, the Moravians ended this Sunday school. There were other changes in Salem as well. A slow transition occurred from a managed general economy and church control of social and economic life to a more American approach to personal liberties. That included more freedom in marital, career, and economic decisions. In 1848, Wachovia's Moravians gained greater independence from European Moravians, and after doing so, became more like their North Carolina neighbors who lived among them. Salem ceased to be a closed Moravian community in 1857. Although leery of the Methodist loud and free-spirited worship and newer sounding songs, Moravians generally maintained good relationships with them, with Baptists and other denominations. Perhaps that explains their phenomena once there was civil war. During the French and Indian War and War for Independence, Moravians kept their distance, but not so in the conflict between North and South. In 1860, Moravians, the seventh most populous religious group in North Carolina, and tied with the Quakers with about 2,000 members, well, they were divided on secession. Their two newspapers were on both sides of the issue as well. When secession and war did come, and when Jefferson Davis called for a day of humiliation and prayer, Reverend Christian Lewis Wrights of nearby Freedburg wrote, "Praying for the Southern Confederacy is not popular here." Yet, pacifism in earlier conflicts took a back seat this time, when Moravians did enlist in the Confederate Army. Perhaps the most famous contingent that enlisted was the 26th North Carolina's band. Here you see it on leave in summer of 1862. We've known it as a struggle, brother against brother, the Civil War. Indeed, here in Salem, it was brethren against brethren, and brethren in the South versus brethren in the North. Moravians from Nazareth and Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, opposing Moravians from Bethabara and Salem, North Carolina. Salem's brass band, however, the image you see here again, served the Confederate cause, supplying bands for both the 21st and 26th North Carolina regiments. The brass band began as a quartet of trombones in Salem in 1771. It soon expanded its activities from being strictly a church ensemble, and by 1791 played secular marches and dance music. In the 1830s, by now a mixed wind ensemble, it was formally organized as the town band with 15 members and began to travel throughout the state. It began to grow in size and the variety of its repertoire through the 1850s. It was said to be Robert E. Lee's favorite. Moravian musicians were at Gettysburg, where one band member recorded, "With heavy hearts we went about caring for the wounded. We were sent for by the commanding officer of the brigade. Dr. Warren sent a note back with Sam Mickey that we could not be spared. A short time later, another order came for us, and we went accordingly to the regiment, where we found men much more cheerful than ourselves. We played for some time, the 11th North Carolina playing with us, and the men cheered lustily. We learned afterwards from northern papers that our playing could be heard across the lines and caused wonder that we should play while fighting was going on and all around us." Indeed, Lieutenant Colonel Arthur Fremantle of Queen Victoria's Coldstream Guards and observer to the Confederate Army wrote in his diary, "When the cannonade was at its height, a Confederate band of music between the cemetery and ourselves began to play polkas and waltzes, which sounded very curious, accompanied by the hissing and bursting of shells." That entry, of course, on July 3rd, just prior to the Pickett Pettigrew Trimble charge. Shortly before Lee's surrender in 1865, the 26th Regiment Band became prisoners of war and remained captives in Maryland until mid-1865. They stayed together as a unit throughout the war, and even during their captivity, they returned home as a unit, but without their instruments, but with all their band books. And by doing so today, the Moravian Music Foundation is the home of the only known complete set of extant Confederate band books from the American Civil War, and the Salem Band, which still exists, is one of the oldest musical institutions in the country. Salem and the Moravians escaped the war until the spring of 1865, when on the evening of the 10th of April, 1865, like Cornwallis a century ago, Major General George Stoneman and his Union cavalry occupied the little Moravian village of Bethania. While many were at church for Easter week observances, men in blue scoured the area for food, forage, and horses. Stoneman lingered only about 3 hours. He wanted to move on to Salisbury to the southwest. His main element crossed the Yadkin about 7 in the morning of the 11th. The day before, about the time Stoneman's men entered Bethania, 28-year-old Quaker Colonel William J. Palmer led his first brigade of Union cavalrymen from Germantown to Winston and Salem. Salem particularly was quite a prize. In the Moravian town, there were shoemakers, gunsmiths, saddlers, coopers, printers, painters, and even a toy merchant. The town was also home to Salem Female Academy, the largest institution in the South dedicated to the education of women. Though quite passive, some 1,500 in the area served in Confederate armies, but though they did, there seemed to be no burning passion for secession. It was in the late afternoon when the 1st Brigade made out the church spires from Salem. Though officials from both Winston and Salem decided to surrender, they and Palmer's men met surprise on the outskirts of the two towns. Some 5 or 6 pickets, home guardsmen, blocked the road, and gunfire erupted. Palmer's vanguard scattered the young men and raced into Salem itself, where they found around 20 to 30 citizens stretched across the road, all with their hands raised. Salem Mayor Joshua Boner, Reverend Robert William Beschweinitz, a Salem Academy administrator, and Winston Mayor T.J. Wilson were amongst those in the road. It was about 5 or 6 in the afternoon. Palmer dismounted, asked about the unexpected welcome by the guardsmen, but accepted the delegation's answer and then walked with members of the party up Liberty to Main Street. A little after 6, Salem teemed with federal horsemen. Most of the girls at the academy were reservedly polite, but not quite as accommodating as one 6-year-old boy by the name of George Haynes Wright, who shouted from a window, "You can't get our horses. We got them hid in the cellar." Both Winston and Salem surrendered, and I imagine most of the horses in the cellar now found. Palmer exercised strict discipline over his men. Guards and patrols were posted to maintain order. Here, depredations were minimum. By the 1880s, an unprecedented period of church growth. The 14 new congregations and membership doubled to over 5,000. By 1900, there were 5,272. And by 1920, 7,877 that belonged to the Moravian faith. That increase was such that Winston-Salem, the two towns merging in 1913, was then the most populated in North Carolina. Despite the questionable morality of the Roaring Twenties, by 1930, membership rose to 11,658, and 10 more congregations had been created. Moravian expansion stretched into southern Virginia, as far east as Eden, and for the first time, down toward the Charlotte area. And yet, in the 89 years since 1930, the church has opened only 13 new churches in North Carolina. The reason? Well, we think due to issues that have been largely outside the control of the church, like the Great Depression, for example. No matter, by the 1950s and 60s, the call to do mission work in areas where other churches had not gone led the Moravians to, believe it or not, the state of Florida. Though 4 congregations were started by 1975, only one survived by 1990. And as every faith has experienced, the church began to wrestle with social issues: divorce, the Vietnam War, nuclear weapons, U.S. policy in Central America and across the rest of the globe, rights and ordaining of women, race relations, and sexuality. Despite those tough issues, if we look back on the impact of the Moravians, there is no question that one of their shining commitments has been to education, and particularly for women. The 4th oldest building and boarding school in America, Salem Academy for Women, was founded in 1772. Though at first matriculation was open for only young Moravian girls, in 1785, a Black female was welcomed. By 1804, outside students were allowed to attend. Notable students in its early history: Sarah Davy, the daughter of the father of this university, William R. Davy. Later, she would be joined by her younger sister, Rebecca. And to the right in this image, Sarah Childress of Murfreesboro, Tennessee, who later married class of 1818 UNC grad James Knox Polk. And a further note, by the 1820s, Salem Academy enrolled the daughters of Cherokee chieftains. The Moravians did not forget young men, but their attempts to compete with so many other male academies and boarding schools restricted their success. We just mentioned a young African-American girl who matriculated in 1785. Though the 1831 North Carolina state law made illegal the educating of Blacks, Bethania found a way to get around the statute by teaching through storytelling. Another jewel in the collective Moravian crown has been their industry and craftsmanship. Thabra had a grist mill by the end of 1755, which benefited not only Moravians, but others of the Western Piedmont. Then in 1839, Johann Christian Wilhelm Fries and his son Francis L. began what would be a very successful woolen mill. And yes, illustrating the glaring inconsistencies of not only Moravians, but other Southern religions, the Moravians of Old Salem did work out an arrangement for the Fries to use slave labor. Because of the successful commerce and trade in Salem, there naturally followed internal improvements. The Fayetteville and Western Plank Road Company was chartered in 1849, and upon completion, it ran 129 miles from Fayetteville to Bethania and was reportedly the longest plank road ever constructed. Another example of Moravian entrepreneurship, John P. Nissen. Sturdy wagon sold incredibly well and contributed to another area of the region's economic success, tobacco. As mentioned in Nanny M. Tilley's The Bright Tobacco Industry, she wrote, "So essential were the Nissen wagons in marketing tobacco that they have been deemed a decisive factor in the development of the tobacco industry through the entire Piedmont area." And business success spilled over to town precedents. For example, Salem was the first in North Carolina, and perhaps the South, to have electric lights in manufacturing plants, in Salem Woolen Mill and Arista Cotton Mills. Winston-Salem also among the first in North Carolina to have telephones, electric lights, electric powered streetcars, and a sewer system. A quick aside, when automobiles made Nissen's wagons obsolete, J.P. Nissen's heirs sold the company and built the 18-story Nissen building that was North Carolina's tallest structure until it was bested by Winston-Salem's Reynolds building in 1929. And the structure that you see here was borrowed for as its architectural design for another skyscraper, the Empire State Building. Another Moravian entrepreneur and humanitarian of great note, Archie K. Davis. He was instrumental in helping to create what today is known as the Research Triangle Park. The man who began his career at Wachovia Bank, which was founded in June of 1870 and now a part of Wells Fargo. Well, he was a member of the Home Moravian Church in Old Salem. And to repeat an accolade, Salem's Moravians have a long history in making excellent music. Although visitors noted other Moravian bands before 1786, the Collegium Museum Salem dates to that year, 1786, and therefore that makes them the fourth oldest group founded in the British colonies or the United States. Moving to social issues and responsibilities, the Moravian Church today teaches moderation, the consumption of alcohol, and in other areas of life. As to state-ordained punishment, Moravians have long been leery. As early as 1849, when newly created Forsyth County asked Salem to build a courthouse with a jail, gallows, and whipping post, Moravian authorities denied their request. When finally a compromise was reached, it was written into the deed that no gallows or whipping post would be built on the land transferred. Today, Moravians maintain an active prison ministry. In other areas of social concern, the church in 1962 allowed the remarriage of those divorced, noting to act compassionately and redemptively with human frailty. And in 1995, the Moravian Synod resolved that in the interest of justice, we oppose without reservation all acts of violence, coercion, and intimidation against persons who are homosexual. In fact, the Moravian Synod recently has allowed for the ordainment of gay clergy. In terms of race, as we have noted, it has been a conflicted history. Even before coming to North Carolina, Moravians were torn, trying to administer to enslaved people while also trying to maintain good relations with local and state governments and slave owners. It's true that the Moravian Church did decide to allow slave holding, even while making them full members of the community and the church. No question, the 1831 state law handcuffed the Moravian Church. We do have record that one Moravian was so repulsed by the church's stand on slavery that he left for Illinois. There, Reverend Martin Hooser founded West Salem and welcomed others from North Carolina that could not reconcile compromises to slave owners and slavery. Of course, the church today has opened its arms to all races. As to women, we have noted that early on the church offered unique and authoritative positions, but that sadly went on a lengthy hold. It took 2 centuries to redress that neglect, but in 1978, Reverend Carol A. Foltz became the first woman ordained in North Carolina since 1786 for the Moravian faith. Since 1978, more than 26 women have been ordained in the southern province of the Moravian Church. For most of us, we know the Moravians for their Christmas and Easter traditions. On the day before Easter, washing and cleaning the flat headstones in God's acre and placing flowers in a graveyard, organized by gender, age, and marital status rather than family. Gathering the next morning in darkness to walk as a congregation to welcome the sun with song and readings. The distinctive Moravian star, the largest in the world, sits atop Wake Forest University Baptist Medical Center. And since 1727, the simple yet elegant and moving love feast. And of course, Moravian sugar cake and cookies. Today, the Moravian Church faces challenges similar to those faced by all Protestant denominations, socially, economically, politically, and theologically. 2 of its newest ministries, Anthony's Plot, named for a slave who gave the Moravians the impetus to begin overseas mission work, is in a Moravian effort that combines residency, community development work, and a socially relevant and spiritually hopeful outreach for all. And the other, the Common Worship Initiative, which offers a non-traditional, informal means of worshiping. It is estimated that worldwide, the Unitas Fratrum or Moravian Church today numbers 1,140,120. Here in North Carolina, there are only 18,180, and that is down some 8% from 1990. Here is global membership for the Moravian faith. What jumps off this image and chart is membership in Africa. And to further astound, of that 907,830, 737,930 are in Tanzania, where 613 congregations worship. That's almost 4 times as many congregations as in all of North America. Here in North Carolina, there are some 50 congregations, 24 of which are in Winston-Salem proper. From its founding in 1457 to its 1722 rebirth, thanks to Count Zinzendorf, Moravians still abide by the inscription on their seal, "Our Lamb has conquered. Let us follow him." And from Bohemia to Herrnhut to Pennsylvania to Bethabara and Bethania and Salem, their motto, message, and mission remain constant. In essentials, unity. In non-essentials, liberty. And in all things, love. This is Freddie Kiger. Thank you for joining us in the UNC General Alumni Association as we conclude our presentation for the Moravians in North Carolina. Thanks again to Douglas and to Dave, and we hope you are well, and we'll look out for the next presentation as we send them forward to you. Be well, be safe. Thanks again for joining us.